Okay, so let's get started. Welcome back, everyone, to lecture 2, the first real lecture of HPS200, Science and Values. There are syllabi up front for anybody who didn't get one. The syllabus is on Blackboard. Take a look at it. It'll give you the schedule. If you haven't seen it already, it'll give you the schedule and sort of the plan. We've already got the first written assignment up on Blackboard. So I just did that this morning, if you haven't checked since this morning. So it's a fairly short written assignment. You'll hand it in on Blackboard as well. It's due July 20th before midnight. So before it becomes July 21st, it's due. And please upload your responses in .doc or .docx format only. If we find PDFs or EPUBs or something like that, we'll ask you to resubmit and consider the first one late. So it's not an essay. This writing assignment is not an essay format. You don't have to do an intro, conclusion. You don't have to include the word "since the dawn of time" at any point. You don't also need any external references. So all of the questions, if you look at the questions, they're all on. There's 4 questions that you'll answer, each question in less than 200 words. And every one of them is about the Grinnell reading, essentially. So the main required reading for the first half of the semester is this book by Frederick Grinnell, The Everyday Practice of Science. And all 4 questions are basically asking about Grinnell's position, which we're going to be talking about extensively in class. So if the questions don't sort of automatically make sense to you yet, that's probably because we haven't talked about it in class yet, or you haven't done the reading yet. So once you've done one and or the other of those things, the question should at least make sense. And what we're looking for are explanations. So an explanation shows me that you understand the material involved. Understanding is best demonstrated by rephrasing. So if you give me block quotes from the text or block quotes from lecture, that shows me minimally that you either read the book or know where in the book to read or showed up to lecture, but it doesn't give me much evidence beyond that that you actually understood it. So the thing that will demonstrate that you understood the material is if you're able to rephrase it in your own words, and there's lots of ways of rephrasing anything, so don't worry about not being able to come up with one. So rephrase it in your own words, draw out connections between the question and other ideas in the course. That's another excellent way to demonstrate understanding. And maybe draw a novel connection that I didn't draw in the course. That would be another way of showing that you not only heard the words that I'm saying, but actually digested them, reflected on them, and can produce sort of novel formulations back to me. All right, so that's the basic assignment 1. The TA will put numerical marks on each of them, but if you want further comments, we'll ask you to email him for further clarification, if that's okay. Your answers will be very, very similar to each other. There won't be like a lot of rich commentary for him to give. It'll be either you understood the ideas of the course or you didn't, and you either use complete sentences that made sense or you didn't. So he'll give you a number, and if you want further clarification, you can email him. I'll give you his email address sort of when the time comes. And if you want to argue your grade, then he'll pass you off to me again, and we'll discuss it. So if that sounds all right. On the final written assignment, you'll get more. It's a more sort of nuanced assignment, so you get more nuanced feedback. This one is basically just warm up for the final written assignment and the short answer questions that'll be on the midterm and the exam. So I don't think this is, I wouldn't block off a whole week of 8-hour days to work on this. It shouldn't be all that strenuous, but do sort of like look at the questions as soon as you can and keep them in mind as we're going forward, because we'll be talking a lot about them. The questions that are on that are the main questions of the course. So, excuse me. Okay, so any questions about the first written assignment? And by the way, I am recording the audio for these lectures, but you can practically not hear you guys at all. So if don't worry about like your voice being captured. You come across as just the barest murmur. So I'll repeat any questions that you say for the sake of the recording and also for the sake of the rest of the class who probably won't have heard it. So if that makes sense. So any questions about the first written assignment? Nobody? OK. Feel free to ask questions at any time once you get into it. Email me or in class. Great. OK. So the lecture topic for today is this question of what are values. We're going to kind of overshoot the specific topic that we're talking about. So recall that the specific topic of the course, the overall topic of the course, is this potentially reciprocal relationship between science and values. And of course, the thing that we're going to be looking at in the first half is the question of whether values can influence science. Now, we're not going to talk about values in the context of science very much today. So my plan for today is to look at values in general, not just in a scientific context, but in a very broad context, to try to get a language in place that we all share. So people use the words ethics or values or normativity. As far as I can tell, they use those words in all kinds of different ways. And if you ask 5 different people what those words mean, you'll probably get 5 slightly different answers. So I don't think that anything that I'm going to say for the first half of this lecture is going to be news to any of you. Really what we're doing is trying to get a common language, so we're all using these words in the same way. And I'm also going to be trying to, well, I am making an argument here. I will be trying to make an argument for one of these views over the other. So here's just 2 views you could take on the relationship between values and science. So as I said, the argument that Grinnell makes is essentially this first one. So he says, yes, values do influence science, and that's a good thing. It's a feature, not a bug. It's how science works. So I'm kind of laying the groundwork for that argument today. And I'm trying to convince you not to accept the second thing. You might say that values don't influence science because values talk is just nonsense talk. Now, so depending on how you use the words ethics and values, I will argue that this is not a good position to take, that we should all pretty much agree that given the way I'm going to use the word values, nobody should accept this. The thing that smart people could accept is that ethics could be just nonsense talk. So I'm going to make a distinction between values and ethics and try to show how values talk, pretty much everyone should agree that it at least has like reference, like at least has a meaningful use in the world. And the thing that smart people can disagree about is whether ethical statements, which are kind of higher order statements about values, can make any sense. Okay? So lots of, I think the standard common sense view is that values are totally a thing. Of course, things are good and bad, and murder is wrong, and stealing is wrong, and that kind of thing. That's the kind of common sense view. But a lot of fairly sophisticated thinkers have questioned whether ethical talk makes any sense. That they argued, this was a very prominent view in English-speaking philosophy in the 20th century, was that ethical talk is just nonsense. Like it's exactly equivalent in content to a chimpanzee howling its distaste at being bullied or something like that. Like a primate's hoot is exactly the same content as murder is wrong, because of the way they thought language works. So if you've never heard anybody question whether ethical talk makes any sense, that's kind of what I'm responding to here. And I'm trying to carve out a space in this course where you could think that. You could totally accept that or believe that ethical talk doesn't make any sense. But I want to show you how value talk can make sense nonetheless. And what we're going to talk about really for the first half of the course is just value talk. And the question of how values in a very specific sense could potentially influence science. So I'm trying to make this first position less controversial and the second position more controversial in the course of this talk. And then at the end, we'll bring it back around a little bit to the question of values in science specifically and lay the groundwork for going into the first chapter of Grinnell. Okay? Okay. And here essentially is the proposal that I'd like to sort of make a case for. And this is essentially the proposal that Grinnell develops, and it's essentially the proposal that I mentioned Helen Longino, another philosopher of science, develops in her social epistemology. And it's that values are actually an essential part of cognition. Not every cognitive act involves values, but the kind of rich cognitive life that a human being leads essentially involves having values. Because we are finite agents, we need to pay attention to, we need to decide what to pay attention to, what projects to engage in and which ones not to engage in, and how to navigate our relationship with our finite sensory apparatus. We need values to structure the world for us. We use values to sort of pick out what's important and not important in our world. Right? And that's, so that might seem counterintuitive now, but hopefully I can make a case for this. That's the hope today. All right. So starting from the very simplest, most basic kind of question, what are values? So compare the statement, this apple is red, to the statement that this apple is good. Right? One of those is a descriptive claim. It just says what is the case. And I think it's very difficult for anybody to argue with that apple is red. But you might not all agree that that apple is good. And you're saying something more than just that it is red or that it is crunchy or that it is nutritious, right? You're saying something normative. We talk about normativity whenever you're using words like good or bad, ought or should. If you say you have a moral obligation to something, that's normative language. Important or interesting are also normative, right? So what is it that, so we'll just do a couple of examples. The normative versus descriptive statement. You should wash your hands is a descriptive statement about what you ought to be doing. You didn't wash your hands is just a fact of the matter. You ought to take your time there. It's a normative claim. You're faster than yesterday is just a fact of the matter. You could be saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. Murder is wrong. Clearly normative. You're clearly saying that there should be less murder in the world. We should be trying to reduce the murder rate. The murder rate is down is just a fact about the world, right? It's just, there's no sort of normative spin on that. Charity is a virtue. It's bad to litter. Usury is a sin. All normative claims. Usury is the charging of interest on a loan, by the way. Charitable donations are up, littering is common, OSAP charges interest. All of those are just facts of the matter. They're not saying whether anything's good or bad. So this is normative language, and the question is whether it has any kind of interest or influence over the scientific project, or is the scientific project just descriptive? And the common sense view, I think, is that science is just descriptive. Okay. So one of the things that might lead you to think this is that you can measure descriptive stuff really easily. Well, not really easily, but you can measure it usually. You can measure the color of an apple. You can say which frequencies of light are bouncing off of it and give a really definite answer that any well-calibrated measurement device should agree on what color that apple is or which colors it is. But can you measure its value? Like, what metric would you use to decide whether that apple is good or not? It's not so obvious. Right? It's not so clear that there even is a way of measuring value. Right? Or what value statements even correspond to in the world. Right? Like, is there a fact of the matter about whether that apple is good, or is that just, I don't want to use the word purely subjective. We'll get back to the words objective and subjective at the end of this lecture because they are very tricky words, but does it even make sense to talk about measuring the value of something? What I'm going to present to you, my sort of suggestion for how to make values talk concrete. This is my proposal for how to make this as maximally concrete as I know how, is to relate things on a 4-level model. We're gonna deal with the level of behavior first, and then goals, then values, and then ethical theories. So nothing more concrete than behavior. Behavior is the one that's sort of completely obvious that it exists in the world, right? Nobody disagrees that living things behave various ways. And what I'll claim is that this behavior of living things is typically organized around goals. They have things that they want to bring about, or things that they sort of bias towards, and things that they bias away from. So your goals structure your behavior. Your goals say, of the space of all of the possible things that I could do, you have a great many behaviors available to you as a living thing. Which one of them should I realize? Which one should I pick out of the space of possibilities? Which ones should I make actual? And your goals are kind of the intermediate thing that says which of your behaviors you should be doing. So they kind of structure and organize your behavior. And similarly, your values structure and organize your goals. So your values tell you which goals you should be setting for yourself. Right? It's kind of just like big meta goals. You could argue that in this way of breaking things down, there's really not that much difference between goals and values. Values are just sort of the abstract, non-specific, overarching goals, like meta goals that organize your goals, and then your goals organize your behavior. Now, there's a fourth level here of ethical theories, and so everybody in this room, I guarantee, but the fact that you're able to get to this room means that you can behave in various ways and that you're able to set goals for yourself at the very minimum, right? So you set the goal of showing up to this lecture today and you've accomplished it. Yeah, okay, congratulations. And that very likely means that you've got some values, you've got some things that you think are important, and you set the goal like you think that maybe your education is important or just succeeding at your life projects are important. And that's why you set the goal to show up here this morning, and that's why you brush your teeth and put on your shoes and walk to your whatever. So everybody's got at least the first three layers. Now, ethical theories are, according to this way of speaking, ways of justifying values. So the question is, which values should you adopt? There are a variety. Different cultures have emphasized different values throughout history. Different people have different values even within a culture. So ethical theories are supposed to be some story or account about which values are the values that you should be adopting and reinforcing in yourself, cultivating, and that kind of thing. So as a matter of fact, not everybody has an ethical theory. Not everybody has a story in their head about why they should have the values that they have. And this is the level at which very reasonable people start to disagree about whether that's a thing or not. So a lot of smart people have claimed that the sphere of ethical theories is just kind of nonsense talk. It's not very serious. It's not something that you actually need. Basically, you just have the values that some combination of your culture and your biology gave you this sort of stuff that you think is important, and that's the end of the story. Right? There's nothing further above that which would justify trying to have some set of values over another set of values. So a lot of smart people have thought that. A lot of smart people have thought the opposite as well, that there are actually facts of the matter about which values you should have, and that you can justify values by citing one of these ethical theories. So there are two optional readings on Blackboard right now about, there's a fifth level above this called meta-ethics, where you talk about what would it be to have an ethical theory, what would make an ethical theory itself justified. So there's a 10-minute video called Crash Course Philosophy on meta-ethics, and there's a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on meta-ethics. They're both optional. None of the materials from those will be on the test midterm, or you are not responsible for repeating them on any of the assignments, so it's really genuinely optional, just for your interest. I kept hoping that I would find something kind of in between those two, so the 10-minute YouTube video is good. You can't do better in terms of learning philosophy in 10 minutes, but it's not very in-depth, and the Stanford Encyclopedia article is very in-depth, but it's really not great for non-philosophers. They think that they're writing to a generally educated public. They're trying to just communicate to a generally educated public, but the way philosophers write, if you're not used to it, can be really frustrating. the only hint I can offer you is to go really slowly. So it takes me about 1 minute to read a page of a novel and about 10 minutes to read a page of philosophy. So I'm actually 10 times slower is the pace that I read philosophy. I'm pretty quick. So so there's the 4-level model. Behavior, goals, values, and ethical theories. And you could imagine we won't even talk about the next level up of meta-ethics. But for the sake of this course, what I'm claiming is, or at least the first half of this course, we're going to be interested in the values level, not really the ethics level. But we're going to overshoot and talk about ethics in this class to give you a kind of frame for this stuff, to give you context. So you have a rich understanding of this stuff and are able to relate it to a bunch of the stuff that you've probably heard about ethics. Like, I would be totally shocked if none of you have ever heard any ethical theories at all. That would be really surprising to me. But maybe you haven't sort of put the various ethical theories together into a picture. So that's what we'll try to do for most of the rest of this lecture, is talk about the various ethical theories. But let's go through these one more time, build up from the start, and sort of get specific about what we mean here, because I'm meaning fairly specific things by these terms. So behavior, all of the things that you can do. And I want to emphasize that I mean all of the things that you can do, including mental acts. So if I wave my hand, that's a behavior. If I make one of these face noises, that's a behavior. But also, if, for example, I'm sitting working on a math problem, and I'm stuck, I'm just sitting there, I'm looking at it, just sitting there. The moment before I sort of have an insight and realize how to solve it, I'm in one state, and then you don't have to make an aha noise. You don't have to do anything physical. Realizing how to solve it is a kind of behavior, I claim. So this is under the scope of behavior. We're going to include things like stomping around and making noises, but also things like noticing things or having an insight. Those are incredibly important kinds of behavior. Like, having an insight might be the most important behavior you ever do in your life. Some insights change the world. So let's include that in the list of behaviors. Right, so all of the things that you can do with your mind and body count as behaviors. There's a lot of them. There are so many of them that picking just one is actually very hard. So the space of possible behaviors is vast beyond imagining. Right, and goals are the main way, I would argue, of organizing our behavior. So having goals allows you to select. So through the filter of a goal, you select amongst the vast number of possible things that you could do, some things that you ought to do if you want to achieve that goal. You can have humongous life goals like being highly educated or being an excellent athlete. These are massive life goals. And you can also have extremely short-term goals. So for example, you might have the goal of making yourself a cucumber and cheese sandwich, right? So let's start from the goal of having lunch, right? So you have this short-term goal, having lunch. So you go into your kitchen and you formulate a sub-goal of, I'm going to make a cucumber and cheese sandwich. So you've got a sub-goal under your goal, and to achieve that sub-goal, you have to go get some cucumber and some cheese and some bread. But if you don't have one of those ingredients, cheese, cucumber, and bread, you might reformulate your sub-goal, right? So, okay, I can't make a cucumber and cheese sandwich. I'll just have a cheese sandwich. Fine. So you reformulate in order to achieve your meta-level goal. Your meta-level goal here being just have lunch. You reformulate some of your sub-goals, right? So your goals tell you not just how to behave, but which sub-goals to have, and in that sense, organize your behavior in this really highly detailed way. You could not get through your ordinary day without formulating goals and sub-goals and sub-sub-goals and so on. Right? If you just go into your kitchen and start enacting behaviors at random, the probability that you're going to end up with lunch is extremely low. You are very unlikely to produce an edible lunch by just doing random behaviors in your kitchen. Right? So to be effective in the world, and you've all made it to university, so you're all clearly effective in the world, you have to have goals. And I would argue that all living things have goals. Sunflowers turn towards the sun, protozoa swim away from poison and towards food. things like that. Philosophers debate whether this goal talk can be reduced to another kind of talk, but for our purposes, it doesn't really matter. We all have goals. Right. Okay. And then the relationship between goals and behavior is one of organization. So your goals help you organize your behavior into a coherent sort of flow. Right. And then your values play the same relationship to your goals as your goals did to your behavior. Your values organize your goals. So which goals should you set for yourself? And they act like abstract meta goals. Usually when people talk about values, they're talking about something more stable than goals. So you might have, you had a goal for your lunch to make lunch. That goal sort of appears and then disappears as you achieve it or give up on it. Typically when people talk about values, they talk about something more stable. So, you value connection with your community. And that's not just something that you do over lunch, that's something that you typically have for weeks or months or years. If it's something that you value, typically it's more stable. So that's one of the ways of distinguishing values from goals, the stability. You might also think that values, most people when they talk about values, they talk about something that's more abstract. They don't say, I value having, one of my values is having lunch today. Usually you mean something not tied to a specific time and place. It's something that it's a goal that it's kind of meta goal that you use to define goals across contexts, typically. Okay, so your values could essentially be summed up as your picture of where it makes sense to spend your time, your energy, and your resources. Hi, yeah.
I just had a question.
Yeah.
I was thought that goals was some kind of cognitive behavior. Does
Right.
that also apply to sunflowers facing the sun?
Right, so the question is, goals are typically understood as a cognitive thing, and does that still apply to sunflowers? It's an excellent question about which there is a great deal of debate. So people like the inactivists, Maturana and Varela, argue that we should actually think of cognition as starting at the lowest levels of life. So the sunflower has cognition, bacteria have cognition, they just have a really simple version of it, and that they have goals, not only goals, but values as well. That is not universally agreed upon. Lots of people think that no, we should only accept talking about goals in the case of at least organisms that are able to represent their world to themselves. So it doesn't make sense to talk about a goal unless you've got a picture of the world and then a picture of how you want the world to be. And I don't think a bacterium has that. So that's just a big debate. There's a humongous debate about that. My PhD advisor is on the unpopular side of that debate that says organisms all have goals, and that goal-directed talk is indispensable in biology. Biologists use goal-directed talk all the time, and they're divided on whether what they're doing there is just using a kind of shorthand or they're describing a real fact about the world. So, yeah. That's probably an unsatisfying answer because all I said was people disagree, but I don't think I could say anything more definitive than that. And hopefully it won't matter for our case, because the case that we're talking about is human beings who clearly do have the capacity to represent our world and how we want it to be, and the difference between how it is and how we want it. So in our case, clearly we can have goals. So, all right. That's an excellent question, by the way. There's a great deal of philosophy is done on precisely that question. And this is the really frustrating part about philosophy is that in most spheres of life, you can just ask, okay, what do 99% of smart people who've thought hard about it think? And then you just sort of take that on and say, okay, that's good enough for me. I'm not gonna spend my life researching this if 99% of the smart people think this. But in philosophy, you get situations where 50% of the smart people think one thing and 50% think the opposite. So that strategy is just not available to say okay, what is the consensus here? Philosophy happens precisely where there isn't a consensus about things. So I'll probably give a lot of answers well, there's a debate about that. So, all right. So there's values. And this is the level that I'm going to argue is absolutely crucial in cognition in general and science in particular as well. So without values, it's really hard to be a cognitive agent. If your goals don't line up in some way with each other, like your goals need to be integrated with each other in various ways, or you're not going to be very effective in the world. You're not going to accomplish much if your goals don't bear some relationship with each other. So to be an effective cognitive agent, generally speaking, is going to mean to have values. Which is not to say that every cognitive act involves values. There are some, I will claim, some value-free cognitive acts when you don't have to make any choices. So the values are about when there's a question about how to proceed, then values are potentially relevant. When there's no question about how to proceed, then they're not. But science and like most human cognition happens in a context where there are choices to be made, and being on the edge of scientific discovery, there are definitely choices to be made. So that's the in for how this stuff's going to relate back to science. All right, so your values organize your goals. Right. So now the controversial level, the level where not everybody has an ethical theory that they like. Not everybody believes that ethical theories even make sense. So ethical theories are supposed to justify value claims, to tell you which things you should value. And the thing that people disagree on is whether whether values claims can be justified. Can you tell me which value claims are good, which is itself a value claim? And people disagree. Again, this is your philosophy for you. And they've been disagreeing vigorously for several thousand years. So this is a different relationship. Recall that values organize goals and goals organize behavior. I would argue that we should think about the relationship between ethical theories and values in a different way. They don't just organize, but they justify. They tell you which ones you should have. Probably most of you haven't thought a lot about ethical philosophy, which means that you don't actually have an ethical theory in your head. But nonetheless, your values are organized in various ways. Like you probably don't have both an extremely high value on compassion and on dominating everybody you meet, right? So those would be two conflicting values. Probably you don't put both of those very high, which means there's some relationship between the values that you hold already. So your values are also organized. The question for ethical theories is whether your values can be justified. So if somebody says, you know what I really like? I really like making people angry for no reason. Love it, just love it. That's a value that they're expressing. Can you say to them, well, you shouldn't love that. You shouldn't value that. You should find something else to do with your life because that's bad for some reason. And what you're trying to tell them there is this value is not a value you should hold. Okay, and how do you even make that case? So I would like to present to you, this is my ad hoc way of separating out the various kinds of ethical theories. Once again, if you ask 5 different philosophers, they'll give you 5 different ways of carving this space up. And I'm not a philosopher of ethics, I'm a philosopher of science, so this is not my area of specialty. And if you asked an ethicist, they'll probably find at least a couple of things that I sort of am garbling here. But for the purposes of this course, and especially keeping in mind that we're not going to be dealing that much with ethical theories, it'll come back a little bit in the first half of the second half of the course, the beginning of the second half, where we talk about Sam Harris and Philippa Foot. But for the most part, this is just sort of for context. So I'd argue that there are basically 4 kinds of ethical theories that you might hold. Ethics of happiness, ethics of duty, ethics of virtue, and ethics of care. And these are different ways of justifying value claims, or different broad categories of ways of justifying value claims. Right. So ethics of happiness, we'll start there because it's probably the one that you're most familiar with. Most people are familiar with at least utilitarianism. So utilitarianism is the view that what we should value is what produces the most happiness for the most people. Right? So if you say murder is wrong, what you're saying is murder produces more unhappiness than happiness. And there's various formulations of utilitarianism. You could either have like a most happiness for the most people, or which is I think the most popular one, or the most happiness for you personally, which is kind of egotistical utilitarianism. There are varieties of ways of cashing this out, but the overall theme is just that the thing that justifies values, the things that tells you what values you should value, is what brings about the most happiness for the most people. So you should wash your hands means, essentially, there will be greater happiness in the world if you wash your hands. Right? Okay, so, and there's a wide variety of these ethics of happiness. Utilitarianism is probably the most common one. Is that fairly clear? Okay, there's also the ethics of duty. There's another broad category of ethical theory. And basically this says what value statements say, or the way to justify value statements is to show how they fall under one of the various duties that you have. The absolute classic one of this is the kind of, I think no theologian accepts this way of reading the Ten Commandments, but the Ten Commandments saying just like, here are your duties. Thou shalt not kill. That's just a duty, and the thing that justifies it is that God said so. So God told us basically how to act, and what's good is to follow those rules. So classic duty-based conception of morality. Immanuel Kant famously tried to do another version of this called the categorical imperative. So this thing here is the categorical imperative. It says, act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. So Kant thought, so the classic theological deontology says, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. Why are those justified? Because God said so. Kant makes a different kind of justification for his duties, and he thinks that these things are incumbent on us as rational agents because so for example, don't lie is justified for Kant on the basis that if everybody lied, then the very act of saying things to somebody else would be undermined. So you can't consistently lie and at the same time wish that everybody else lied as well. Right? So what you do is undermine the very institution that you're using to communicate. Don't worry about, I'm not going to test you on Kant. Don't worry about that. All this stuff is, like, this should be a whole course to cover ethics. We're just kind of skimming over it. All right, so I hope the basic idea is clear. So this ethics of duty is an ethical theory. There's a type of ethical theory wherein you have a bunch of duties that you must fulfill, usually characterized as a law or like as a universal rule. So never do this, always do that. Right? And the stories that people produce about how this justifies ethics vary quite widely. All right. So you should wash your hands equals you have an ethical duty to wash your hands for one reason or another. All right. Another category, another broad category, ethics of virtue. So what we should value is being a good person. And the different virtue ethics theories have different pictures of what a good person is. So Buddhism is one kind of virtue ethics where they say, here's what a good person is. A good person is somebody who is not full of desire and clinging, right? What makes a good person is the ability to reduce your own suffering and the suffering of others. So what your virtue ethics theory says is strongly dependent on what kind of person you think is a good person. So Aristotle is another virtue ethics guy, and he's got this list of virtues, and he thinks that being a good person is finding the mean between two extremes. So you should be generous, but not too generous. You should be courageous, but not reckless. And he also says you should throw the right number of parties for your friends with the right amount of booze at it. Right? So it's not none. You should throw some parties. You should not be partying every night, but you should throw at least some nice parties for your friends with the right amount of food and booze at them. Compare that to the Buddhist picture of what makes a good person, who say you should never drink at all. Drinking is bad because it inflames desire, which leads to suffering. So the right number of booze-filled parties with your friends is 0, according to the Buddhists. Whereas Aristotle, it's whatever is in your means, like whatever you can reasonably afford and whatever kind of fits your social milieu or whatever. So Yeah, question.
So why do we need this as a separate category? Considering it seems like you need already values to decide what a good person is. So like, how does this help you deciding what values you should have?
Right, good. So the question is, how does saying what a good person is help you decide which values to value? And that's an excellent question. And basically, you need to get into each of the specific theories, and each of the specific theories will have their own story about why you should value, why one thing is what makes a good person and why one thing doesn't make a good person. And typically that's tied to, I mean, in Buddhism, that's tied to cosmological picture. So they say, here's how reality is structured, right? And that story about how reality is structured, you find your place in it, right? They tell you, here's where you are in the shape of the cosmos, and that leads you to think that some things are good and some things are bad. So the story about how you should act is typically deeply tied into a story about how reality is structured. For Buddhism, you're stuck in the cycle of rebirth, which is just like terrible all the time. For Aristotle, it's that you're stuck in between sort of like the perfect sphere of rationality and the crummy world of materiality, and that what you should do is try to elevate your mind to the world of rationality. So typically, these stories about virtue are tied to stories about how reality is structured. You really have to, it's a good question, you really have to get into the specific ethical theories to find out why they think that it's justified, and it's a meta-ethical question about whether any of them can succeed or not. Okay, another question.
So I have a question about the differences
Yeah.
between ethics of duty and ethics of virtue, because you know, thou shalt not steal God.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's technically only a religious thing, isn't it? But it is technically in the Christianity, I'm guessing, aspect. While you brought up Buddhism, there are also like duty things as well.
Right.
So how do you draw a line between those two?
Good. So the question is, how do you distinguish? Is there really a distinction, for example, between the ethics of duty and the ethics of virtue? So couldn't you just say, in this case, look, you have a duty to be thus and so. Like you have under Buddhism, you have a duty to be compassionate and not to get drunk on Friday nights, or you could rephrase the duty ethics stuff in terms of virtues, like it's virtuous not to steal or lie or kill. Can't you translate between them? And I think that's actually a really good insight. The more I think about this stuff, the more I suspect that you could translate from any one of these types into any of the other types. So I really like virtue ethics. I have a friend who really likes utilitarianism, so ethics of happiness. And anytime I try to offer him like an ethical principle, he's immediately able to translate it into his utilitarian way of thinking. And anytime he offers me an ethical principle, I'm fairly reliably able to translate it for myself into virtue ethics, because that's my favorite. Probably the best strategy for navigating ethics is to be aware of all of these categories and be able to sort of see how statements in one can be translated into statements of the other. So philosophers love debating this question about whether there are some things that just can't be captured by the other kinds of theories in favor of their, so they say this is the best one because it says things that can't be captured in others, and people who subscribe to the other theories try to translate it into their own. So probably there is, well, okay, I don't know of a thing that says this is the one and only good kind of ethical theory to sort of definitively say you can't translate things in one ethical theory to another. So again, I feel like I'm apologizing a lot for the state of philosophy in this class, but we really have been trying our best for a couple thousand years now, and this is where we've gotten. So if you can do better, please come sort us out. Lots of people have tried, but yeah. Okay, we'll just quickly do ethics of care, and then we'll take a break. So final category, ethics of care says what you should value is what maintains basically your social relationships and in proportion to how close your social relationships are. So Confucius is probably the main famous historical person for this way of thinking. Confucius says, here's what you should do. You should be a good child to your parents. You should be a good sibling to your siblings. You should be a good parent to your children. And you should be a good citizen of your state. Right? Those relationships are the primary stuff of ethics for Confucius, and maintaining them is what constitutes living a good life. Living a good life is being in these close relationships. So you should wash your hands means something like washing your hands is what a good child, parent, sibling, classmate, employee, citizen, etc. would do. One of the weird features of the other classes of ethical theories is that they tend to be framed in this really abstract way. So the most happiness for the most people thing, the happiness of somebody on the other side of the planet that I've never met before is exactly equal to the happiness of like my close family or something like that. And there's no distinction made between the two. Whereas most people's ethical responses, like I certainly have a life where I'm like much more attached and interested and attentive to my family and then my friends and then my broader community than I am to people that I have no concrete relationship with. So this way of understanding ethics sort of builds that in at the ground floor and says, look, your primary ethical responsibilities are based on your primary relationships in your life, something like that. And the ethics of care actually comes out of a feminist ethics, but I think Confucius is probably the ideal sort of exemplar of this stuff. Anything else on ethics of care? Start back up again. Right, so we're talking about various ethical theories. Recall that my claim here is that everybody has values. Everybody needs to have values to be even moderately effective in your life, regardless of what you're trying to do. Not everybody necessarily needs to have an ethical theory. And of course, there are serious questions to be raised about whether ethical theories as a whole are even coherent. And that's the questions of meta-ethics. But again, meta-ethics is like 2 levels of analysis above what we're going to be dealing with for the rest of the first half of the semester, which is the values level. I just want to drive this home very briefly, and then we'll turn to talk a little bit about how this relates to thinking about science. And talk about, so one of the things that philosophers, some of the questions that we had before the break were very interesting about like, hey, is there actually any difference between these theories? And philosophers spend most of the time in ethics trying to find test cases where you can say, well, this theory makes one prediction and this theory makes a different prediction about what is right and wrong, and then you can compare those to your intuitions. My impression is that there's a lot more overlap than philosophers tend to emphasize. So philosophers emphasize the difference because they want to figure out which theory is the right one or the better one. But there's actually quite a lot of overlap, which is why most people don't need an ethical theory to get along in their life, because most of the ethical theories that are common actually make very similar predictions for most situations. Like there's not that much. I think the degree of variation in ethical frameworks, in the predictions of ethical frameworks, is perhaps overstated typically. So instead of trying to find differences between these, I propose that we should look at a couple of normative statements. These are value statements, and how the different types of ethical theory might be brought to bear to justify them. So again, you should eat a balanced diet. This expresses either a goal or a kind of overall value towards sort of eating balanced diets. And here are some different justifications that you could give for that, some different reasons why you should value that from the different ethical theories. So the ethics of happiness might say, you and your social circle would end up with net higher happiness if you eat a balanced diet. So you'll have more energy to go do stuff with them, which makes them happy, or something like that. Ethics of duty might frame the same proposition, the same normative proposition in terms of your obligations. So your obligation to maintain your health, which is fulfilled by your balanced diet, maybe because, again, possibly because God said so. So if you come from a religious tradition where it says, your body's a temple that should be maintained with immaculate care because God laid that duty on you, that might be your justification. Or you might, I'm not sure if you can justify that with Kant's categorical imperative. You get the idea, anyhow. Ethics of virtue it's virtuous to be in good physical health. Aristotle and the Buddhists both think that, which is then supported by a balanced diet. So what it means to be a good person, lots of virtue ethics theories include in what their picture of a good person that you're physically healthy, or that you try to maintain your physical health as best you can, something like that. Ethics of care would probably frame this in terms of your primary relationship is, of course, with yourself, that you have a duty to take care of yourself, because if you don't do that, then you can't fulfill any of your other relationships. So eating a balanced diet is taking care of yourself, which is the basics of ethics of care, and therefore you should do that because that's the sort of way that you maintain your social relationships. Right? So same value judgment, 4 slightly different styles of justification, and I mean the clever amongst you are probably busily translating these into each other, saying like, no, isn't this all just, and if you'll probably say, isn't it all just my favorite ethical theory, whatever the one that you like best is, and you'll reduce all of the others to that. That's fine. Okay, so murder is wrong. Ethics of happiness, as murder generally causes more unhappiness than happiness, although notice the very curious fact about utilitarianism that says if there's a murder that would make more people happy than unhappy, then you should do it. This is one of the counterintuitive sort of consequences of us. The naive versions of utilitarianism. They've got more sophisticated versions that are specifically designed not to come up with that result. But the simple naive version, if a murder makes more people happy than unhappy, somebody's really unpopular or something, and everybody around is really mean, then you should do it. But if you wanted to justify murder as wrong, you could do it on the very sensible principle that usually it creates more unhappiness than happiness. Ethics of duty, again, God said, thou shalt not kill. Ethics of virtue, so Buddhism says murder is the manifestation of unvirtuous states of mind. So it's not that, especially traditional Theravada Buddhism says you shouldn't murder people because it makes you all bent out of shape and unhappy. That you personally will suffer if you murder somebody, so that's why you shouldn't do it. Mahayana Buddhism is a little more socially oriented, less fixed on the individual, but they say that the old school Buddhism says you shouldn't murder people because it'll make you unhappy, not because it'll make it's unvirtuous for you, it'll cause suffering in you, which being a good person is having the least amount of suffering. And ethics of care, of course, murder is typically an extreme violation of the norms of social relationships. There's very few things that could be as destructive. Well, there's a few, but it's extremely destructive to your social relationships to go around killing people. That's why you shouldn't do it. Right. You ought to study for the exam, so you and your society will be happier overall. Everybody's happier if you're successful, so try to be successful. Ethics of duty, you might think that you have a duty to just at least try your best at your work. Ethics of virtue is that diligence, for example, is a virtue. Typically, people consider in whatever virtue ethics theory you've got, doing a good job is what it means to be a good person, or part of what it means to be a good person. And ethics of care, of course, you have some social relationship to either yourself, who is taking care of you by paying for your own education, or somebody is paying for your education, and you have a sort of social relationship that you want to maintain with them. So it's in virtue of trying to, I think probably a lot of people in this room are here because their parents really wanted them to go to university. So that's the sort of main ethical duty that they're responding to, the ethic of care stuff. All right. It's good to take care of the elderly. Do we want to keep doing this? Here's one. Okay, so let's try to produce some. So lying is immoral. So what would an ethic of happiness justification for this normative principle be? Yeah?
Lying generally makes more people unhappy.
Perfect. So lying generally makes people more unhappy than happy. Excellent. How about ethics of duty? Yeah?
Sorry, duty to be honest in our everyday life.
Excellent. And so the answer is we have an ethical duty to be honest. This is what Kant thinks. God also mentioned something about it. So ethics of virtue. So what's a virtue ethics reason for avoiding lying? honesty is a virtue. Yeah. Exactly. So honesty. So if part of what your picture of what a good person is includes honesty, then honesty will be ruled out, or lying will be ruled out by virtue ethics. Aristotle does have this as one of his virtues, by the way, honesty, but he says that you should find the mean. You shouldn't be lying, but you also shouldn't be telling everybody everything all the time. So you should kind of moderate yourself and maybe don't be like, wow, it's nice to see you, but that shirt is terrible. Like you might not want to tell everybody everything. So, and ethics of care, lying is immoral. So this is ethics as your responsibilities pertaining to your primary social relationships. Yeah?
Lying can hurt relationships.
Lying can absolutely hurt relationships. Okay, excellent. All right, so that's it. You got it. You got the basic idea. I think these were my, and they basically exactly matched yours. So at least those people who are answering the questions clearly got it. So excellent. Okay, so once again, this 4-level model. So what I'm proposing is that your skepticism should start somewhere between values and ethical theories. I think that I'm what you would call an ethical realist, so I think that you can make true or false ethical claims, and therefore at least one or maybe some of the ethical theories are justifiable in some way. But if you don't think that as well, you're still welcome here. You can still participate in the rest of this course because really what we're going to be talking about is the values, goals, and behavior level of things. Okay. So to bring this around briefly, I don't think we have all that much more to do today, but I want to start in on the project of bringing all this values talk back around to talk specifically about science. So Grinnell argues that values tell us what to study and how hard. So that's a pretty obvious one. I think, I find it hard to understand how anybody would dispute that. Like, you have to pick which projects to spend money on. Are you going to build a particle accelerator, or are you going to try to, discover new vaccines? Where do you spend your time, energy, and money? And all of these value questions are, of course, about where is a good place to spend your time, energy, and resources. Right? So that's a fairly obvious one. The perhaps less obvious way that Grinnell is going to argue that values play a role is in what he calls the problem of noticing. So the problem, recall, of course, that under the behavior, this is why under behavior I wanted to include things like mental acts. One of the most important behaviors you can engage in, especially in the context of science, is noticing things. And this is not a trivial problem. Noticing things is actually really hard, or being good at it is really hard. It's one of the most sophisticated things that a human being can do with their minds, is especially to notice something novel, right? So you've got a bunch of information in front of you. You cannot possibly notice everything about it. That's the constraint, that you're being inundated with vastly, vastly more information than you could possibly sort of sort through comprehensively, and you are always having to decide what about it to notice. And this is one of the ways Grinnell claims that values play a really important constitutive role in science. So let's do an example. All right, so let's play with noticing very briefly. So I'm going to manipulate, I can't manipulate your values are fairly stable, but you can entertain goals temporarily. So I'm going to offer you a series of goals to think about to notice stuff about this. So suppose that your goal is to buy a new home, right? Now, please look at this and see what you notice about it. You're a potential home buyer. What do you notice about this picture? Just shout out stuff if you want. I hope you notice some things.
Big windows.
Nice big windows. Looks like it's an all right, I don't know, looks like a nice neighborhood. There's trees and stuff, you know? Yep, yep. Good, okay. So, you've noticed some things. Now, consider this picture from the perspective of somebody who has to take care of a toddler. So you're in this space, you're a babysitter, and there's a toddler running around, and you have to keep them safe. Now what do you notice?
There's a lot of breakable plants.
There are a lot of breakable plants. I would be very concerned about those plants.
Candles.
Yeah, yeah. I'd be worried about the edges of this table. You know?
Glasses.
That laptop is in serious trouble if there's a toddler around. Okay. Now, imagine your goal is to break into this house. You've been let in to check the gas meter, and you're planning to come back and rob them. Now what do you notice?
Big windows.
Big windows again. It's same. It's overlap. But yeah, nice big windows.
It's very cluttered. It's going to be hard to move around.
Yeah, yeah. You're gonna have to plan your route.
You might have to climb. It looks like it's on the second floor.
Good. Yeah, yeah. Excellent. Okay, okay. You get the idea, right? You get the picture that depending on what your goals are, you're going to notice different things. Different things are going to leap out at you as important, right? As salient, as relevant. Deciding what's important is one of these incredibly complex cognitive acts that so far only humans are capable of. So enjoy that while it lasts. AI is coming up on our heels very quickly, but so far, human beings are the only objects on this planet that can, at the level that we do, sort what's relevant from what's irrelevant. So you give us a whole bunch of data, and we're able to sort it for the important stuff in ambiguous contexts like this. So not all contexts are this ambiguous, of course. So values help constrain the problem of figuring out what to notice, and that means that they can play a cognitive role. Sorry, I'm going to skip ahead here, but so I don't want to claim that values are potentially important in absolutely every context. I think that's false. So for example, 2 + 5 = 7, really no values involved in making that determination. If you want to figure out if that's true or false, I don't see any important role for values in that process, right? So, and that even true for the kind of subtle, sophisticated scientific values that Grinnell's going to argue play a role. So one of the emerging things in philosophy right now is to think about epistemology, which is theory of knowledge, so to think about the way that we gather knowledge in terms of virtues or in terms of values. So these are presented as scientific values, right? Things that basically everybody has to agree on that these things are important, or you're kind of not doing science. So anybody who's doing science shares these essential values, like you want your claims to be accurate and reasonably precise. You want them to be fairly simple. You want them to be fairly general. You want them to be consistent with each other. You want them to be fruitful in the sense that they give you ideas for new things to ask about, new things to test. And you want them to be impartial in the sense that you're not cheating or something like that. You're not putting your thumb on the scale. And that's a kind of impartial, so that's a kind of hint towards value neutrality, right? As a kind of value of science. Well, what it says is you don't want your scientific story to be overwhelmed by extra scientific values. And what Longino is going to say is that there are core scientific values like these, and then there are extra scientific values like being a good friend or having an exquisite aesthetic appreciation of the world. Those are the things that are values, but they're not core scientific values. Right. So even in the absolute core of the scientific sort of like project, these values are potentially relevant, but they're only potentially relevant. And there's a sort of clear sense in which they are not relevant in some types of problems, like 2 + 5 = 7, right? So 2 + 5 = 7, you don't have to decide, how accurate you want to be. You're just fully accurate. There's no question about that. So there's no space in which decisions have to be made. There's no space in which you have to decide what about this baffling equality to notice, right? You've just noticed it all. You've noticed everything there is to notice, and you've got an answer that is as accurate and precise as it can be. Your account is pretty much as simple as you could want it, highly general. It satisfies all of those things kind of as much as they can be satisfied. Right? So there's not really a role to play when there's, and we'll get more into the difference between these two types of problems. In well-defined problems, in problems that are extremely well-defined, where you've got an algorithm for solving the problem, like addition, simple addition problems are like this, they're extremely well-defined problem. Well, now it doesn't matter what your values are, does it? I don't care what you think about what's important in life. If you disagree with this, you're wrong. Right? It's not a matter of your opinion. It's not a matter of anything that you care about or don't care about. If you don't think 2 + 5 = 7, you're wrong. The end. Now, so that's the easy stuff, though, right? And Grinnell's going to argue that there's a lot of kind of textbook knowledge that's like this, that's like 2 + 5 = 7, where, you know, if you don't agree on the atomic number of oxygen, it's not really like, oh, you have your opinion and I have mine. You're just wrong about that. However, there are tons of questions on the cutting edge of science where that's not the case. Right? There's tons of questions where science is not just at the textbook stage, but at the like development and exploration stage, that the questions are wide open in really important ways. For example, when is it okay to exclude data points? So you'll be shocked to hear that scientists exclude data points from their analyses on a very regular basis, right? They clean up weird outliers. If something's just so off that you can't even make sense of how it relates to everything else, they just delete it. And that's fine some of the time. It's not fine some other times. And there's not actually a general rule which will tell you when it's fine and when it's not. Your values in that moment are potentially important. What projects should get funding? This should be an obvious one. This is a giveaway for me. Like, this is just clearly related to what you think is important, even in an extra scientific sense. It's not just like, what are your scientific values? Your global values are clearly relevant to deciding which projects should get funded. What methodologies are reliable? So this is another question where it's simply not the case that we've got this down to a simple rule that you don't have to be an intelligent person to apply. Right? So when is a simulation good enough, for example? When is a simulation a good methodology for understanding a system? And when do you have to do actual concrete experiments? There's not a general answer to that yet. Maybe there could be one day, but currently there is not. So which methodologies are the appropriate ones? And that's something that is specified by what Thomas Kuhn called your paradigm. So your scientific paradigm is just the collection of research strategies that everybody agrees are appropriate for an area, and that's something that's constantly in motion. How should we conduct meta-analyses? So you've got a bunch of studies. Even if you think all of the studies are reliable, you still have to figure out how to put them together. They've all used slightly different methodologies, and they've all used slightly different statistical techniques, and they're all measuring something slightly different. And this is one of the really open, burning questions in science right now is, what strategies for combining studies are appropriate? And again, there is not currently a general accepted answer to that. It's a question that we answer kind of on a case-by-case basis. There are strategies that are widely accepted, but they're not universally accepted. There are serious questions about this. And these kind of open questions in scientific methodology are potentially value-laden. I don't want to say that they always are, but they are potentially value-laden. Whereas questions like 2 + 5 = 7, they're just not. All right. So, which brings us to the extremely sticky question of objectivity and subjectivity. I almost hesitate to even use these words because these words get just brutally misused almost all of the time that they're used. To call something, we call something subjective, typically people mean something like it's all made up or something like that. And to call something objective, people typically don't even have something in mind when they say that. They just mean that they like it. So let's try to regiment this. I'll talk more next time about objectivity and subjectivity, but I want to just give you very briefly the story that Helen Longino gives about this, which is something like the accepted view in philosophy is that you don't get to have the view from nowhere. So if by objectivity what you mean is something that is not mediated through somebody's subjectivity, then we don't get to have any of that. Right? There's we've never experienced anything objective. Nobody's ever described anything objective. There's just no objectivity in our life whatsoever. If you mean by objectivity like something that has nothing to do with the subject, then you can tell just by like thinking hard about that sentence that you're never going to experience anything like that. So you can rule out the possibility of objectivity in your life whatsoever. So if that's what you mean, then we never get to have that. And it's kind of a pointless idea, right? Like, why would you want something that you can't even conceivably get? It's not a matter of just not having good enough science or not being kind of careful and unemotional enough. Objectivity in the sense of a view from nowhere is just conceptually impossible for anybody to experience, access, describe, because all of those are mediated through your subjective experience, right? So if that's what you're wanting, objectivity as just nothing to do with subjectivity, I recommend you give up because you can't have that. However, there are other senses of objectivity that make more sense. I don't propose that we throw the objective-subjective distinction just in total. The kind of objectivity that Longino talks about and the kind of objectivity that Grinnell is going to talk about is a kind of intersubjectivity. It's not, so the distinction is really between subjectivity and intersubjectivity. Okay, so to say something is subjective usually carries the implication that somebody else could see it differently. So if I say, I really like this band, you say, I don't like this band, probably that's a determination that's subjective. Because there's just not a fact of the matter about which one of us is right. So we have different preferences, we have different aesthetic tastes. To say something is subjective in that sense is just to say that people will genuinely differ, and that there's not an answer about who's right. Okay? Objectivity in the sense of intersubjectivity is about when everybody agrees, or everybody should agree, something like that. So if I run an experiment and you run an experiment and somebody else runs an experiment and we all get the same results, that's the beginning of intersubjective agreement. Right? So it doesn't matter who you are or where you are. Something's intersubjective to the degree that it's shared amongst all different points of view. Right? So there's a lot about life that is subjective in the sense that not everybody has to have the same view of it. Your food tastes, your musical preferences, your preferences about art, and maybe even your values could be different from person to person. Whereas science, according to Longino and Grinnell, is trying to sift through the individual differences and find stuff that's intersubjectively reliable. So that, if two different labs measure the value of absolute zero, they're all going to get the same result, or they'll tend towards the same result, or they'll converge roughly over time towards the same result. So it's a fact about all subjectivities rather than what's free from subjectivity, if that distinction makes sense. So the core scientific values are supposed to, if sort of pursued faithfully, are supposed to give us intersubjective agreement, not objectivity in the sense of a view from nowhere. Right? What they're supposed to do is, if we all agree that these are important, and we're all pursuing science according to these values that we've all sort of agreed to partake of, Longino says we have this amazing process for attaining intersubjective agreement. we don't have objectivity. Okay. So is there any further questions about that? Okay, so the next class, we're going to dive into the Grinnell and apply some of this stuff more directly. We're just sort of doing groundwork this class. But read chapter 1 of Grinnell, please. If you haven't got it already, it's in the bookstore. And we'll talk about values and the linear model of science.